everyone, to another episode of the Holden Village podcast. I am your host, Dev, he, him pronouns, and I'm with one of our wonderful Week 9 faculty of the 2023 summer program, David Vásquez-Levy. How would you like to introduce yourself, and what's one inspiring thing that's happened to you this week?
Well, again, my name is David Vásquez-Levy. I use he, him, L pronouns. I serve as president at Pacific School of Religion, PSR. It's a seminary in Berkeley, California. I'm ordained in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, so I'm an ELCA pastor, but I am serving a seminary that is not ELCA affiliated, but is part of a consortium together with a Lutheran school in Pacific Theological Lutheran Seminary, PLTS. I'm a parent of two kids, married to Carla Sumala, with whom I am co-teaching this week. I'm originally from Guatemala and have sort of lived and moved all over the place. A lot of my commitments, interests in my life have to do with connections between academic communities, faith communities, and social change. So something inspiring this week. It's been great to be back at Holden. I came pretty regularly for about 10 years with our family, and was part early on when Abriendo Caminos first started. One inspiring thing is just being back. Take some of the hikes here and just being back with the community. The conversations have been great in the studies and in just listening to others in their presentations. So,
how would you describe Abriendo Camino to our outside listeners? What is that week like at Holden?
It's interesting because I was just talking with some of the folks who were here at the very beginning of it. The words abriendo means to open, and caminos is way, so opening the way. So I think that the origins of it's a 1 week in which Holden tries to create, accommodate a broader space of welcome by utilizing language, Spanish as well as English in a lot of the programmatic offerings. And creating a space for a richer presence of culture, particularly started out with folks from the Yakima Valley, which many of the listeners may be familiar with. Is on the eastern part of Washington, and it's a large agricultural community that has a significant immigrant population. And so a lot of the folks in that area, somebody began to kind of say, we should bring some of those folks to participate at Holden. That group really loved their experience here, and then together with others began to advocate for opening some space for that. So for this week, like many other things, it got disrupted by various transitions the last couple of years with pandemic and mine remediation. But it's great to be back. There's about 100 and some participants that are part of 6 different groups this week from Yakima, Sacramento, LA area, up in Seattle, folks that are coming from Spanish-speaking communities, and just bringing food, culture. There'll be a fiesta this week. There's tortilla making this morning, tamales making tomorrow. There'll be the world famous soccer World Cup.
That's right.
Here, the Holden Cup.
The most important
exactly.
part of the year. Yeah.
I think there's another World Cup going on this week somewhere, but this is the one where it's all happening.
So how would you like to articulate what you are sharing in your presentations with the village?
So Carla, my wife, and I are having an opportunity. We're picking up on the theme for this summer, Eden is Calling, and entitled our session based on one line in Genesis, where Cain, after killing his brother, is exiled from the area, and so lives east of Eden. So he settles east of Eden. So the image of east of Eden has been picked up by a number of different authors over time.
Right.
Steinbeck's probably the most familiar one in terms of the title of one of his books. But it's sort of this image about living outside of paradise. And so we're really trying to invite a conversation about how these sacred stories, the stories that we find in the biblical text, and we're referring to others, but how those particular stories really help us think about these big questions and big issues we are wrestling with as a community, as a nation today, particularly looking at the narratives, the big stories we tell ourselves about immigration, about environment, and how the two connect. So in a way, we're wrestling with these, what we would, Bishop William Barber has called God-sized problems. that need a God-sized solution, right? So how do we think in big picture about these large issues we are facing around, environmental crisis, as well as its implications on massive mobility of people, and the need for us to wrestle with the sacred texts that might help us think about these in new ways.
I'm curious for you, how much of like the internal, like emotional, mental work goes in with the work that you do?
We need a much more integrated solution. We actually have to challenge those binaries of internal and external, of practical and theoretical. We need to queer all of these binaries, right? So the project of colonialism begins, as most folks will know, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Right before that, what Columbus is doing, what led to that was this papal bull, right? That it's a papal edict that just basically justified the fact that Europeans, supposedly on the pretext of conversion, could just go anywhere in the world and just take over land and things. Behind that was a taxonomy, the need to divide the world into certain things. So then the concepts of race that we now live with, come out of that taxonomy, in which you're basically taking the world and analyzing it, dividing it into categories, and placing certain things in categories. Right? In some ways, it led to great developments of knowledge, right? We can organize the world, understand it, and create categories of plants and animals and other things. But the negative implication of it is then we then made the categories we created to understand a very organic world, and then they somehow become standard or the reality, even more real than reality in the world. So when we apply that level categorization to humans, put them into categories of race, put them into categories of who's savage and who's not, right? And what kind of knowledge value and others are not, then that's where, there is this fragmentation, including the fragmentation of the internal and the external, right? Most religious traditions actually have not in its origin, and a lot of the traditions we live with today are Eastern in origin, including Christianity, and Judaism. They have the sense of an integration of the self rather than the separation that really is sort of taking a lot of Greek thought, this very binary thought, and driving it increasingly so to create that division. And I think that separation actually leads to, has significant consequences both on ourselves, on our psyche, on our well-being, and on the way we relate to the created world, to the existing world.
Are there specific binaries that are like close to your heart that you want to integrate in your work?
I think there's a lot of querying that I'd like to do. So it might be helpful just to say a word about my current context. So again, I'm president of Pacific School of Religion. This is a seminary in Berkeley, California, that has had a long history of kind of progressive, being on the sort of progressive end of many social causes throughout its history, over 150 years. But really, it's only in the last 10 years or so that the institution has become truly majority people of color, and it has had a long history of being majority LGBTQ. So our current student body is majority people of color, majority LGBTQ. About 55% of the student body are part of the LGBTQ community. And that's the case also for faculty, staff, board. So part of it is sort of first creating a very alternative reality, right? In a space where these two categories of the full inclusion of humans around their self-identity and their understanding of themselves and sexuality oftentimes is viewed as, particularly within religious settings, as counter to our commitments around racial inclusion. So many churches are splitting over this choice they feel they must make, either to be sort of siding with communities of color or to be siding with LGBTQ communities. So that's a binary I'm very committed to challenging, right? In the sense that actually, if you look outside of many of our faith communities at social movements, many of our contemporary social movements, the Dreamers in immigration, Black Lives Matter within African American advocacy work, many others, the leadership of these groups is majority LGBTQ. So they're coming from communities of color that also are LGBTQ committed. What's important to me that gives me lots of hope is that we know something from being in the in-between, right? People actually live in that queer space, right? So part of our work in theological development and thinking and rethinking the world and challenging binaries, it needs to draw from that experience of what it's like to live in the in-between, right? To challenge the binaries of gender, of sexuality, of race. And what do we know from that experience, either created by migration or identity or a movement? And what have we learned about that? Because that is the wisdom that this colonial project sought to eliminate, right? Is that fragmentation in order to divide and conquer.
Are there specific stories that have shaped your faith journey or shaped your activism?
I think a particular story that I want to share about, an early experience here at Holden with Abriendo Caminos was that I was teaching a course. We were looking at the story of Exodus, and in fact, a lot of the experiences here were captured in a short Bible study I wrote with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. That's called Out of the Waters, and we were reading the story of Moses, just reading through the text in Exodus. And the scene where, in that particular day, we were reading the scene where Moses' mother places Moses into the river. And as we sat in the space, a woman began to cry in the room. And so, who was a participant in Abriendo Camino, an immigrant woman, first generation immigrant. And she began to cry in the class. And so there was silence. We were just kind of trying to create space for listening. And then she began to tell the story of 20 years earlier. She had stood along the U.S.-Mexico border on the Rio Grande and had to hand her child to a coyote. So she was crossing with her child, who was barely a year old, and she needed to get across the border. And the way that they would do it is that she was going to go by land and run across, however she could get across with a group, but the baby was going to be taken by the coyote with another child's papers through the border checkpoint, but using somebody else's ID, right? But she had to let go of the child at that moment, not knowing whether she would be able to make it across, see her baby again across. And so she stood there, and that just transformed for me, reading a text that I read a million times about what is going on for Jochebed, which is the name that the tradition gives to Moses' mother, to make that decision. And at that point, as many periods of heightened anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, there was the sense of the questioning about why people will often say, how can they do this to their children, right? And, so not to be able to understand in the sacred text what somebody whose commitment and love for their children forces them to exercise whatever agency they have within extreme limitations, And so at that moment for me, there's a phrase about the Bible that, it's been popularized, or I've heard it a number of times to the point I don't know the source, but is that all the stories in the Bible are true, and some of them even happened. Right? So at that moment, that story is true. It is a story of an immigrant woman who's desperate by her displacement and by the fear of power that threatens the life of her child. And so she makes the only choice she feels she can make. She exercises whatever agency she has. We know what happens in that story, but not at that moment, right?
Yeah.
She doesn't know what will happen at that point, just like this woman in the Bible study when she had made a decision 20 years earlier. Her son was with her at Holden that week and turned 21 while we were here.
That's wonderful. How would you like to see your work evolve?
Talking about my own work, right? So this week we are focusing on this connection between environment and migration. It's a deeply integrated reality. And my hope in my work, as well as all of our work, is to see the connections between these various passions that we hold, right? There's a lot of communities, congregations that are committed to the environment and are becoming increasingly aware of the kind of crisis we are living with. Sometimes we look at that and we are focused on one conversation, and sometimes then may think we don't have space or energy for other issues, right? And so we might not have, as a congregation or as an individual, the capacity or the attention to look at something like immigration. The reality is that they're deeply connected, right? And so the face of the environmental crisis is most clearly captured in displaced immigrants around the world right now.
Yeah.
Because the environmental shifts, they are the canary in the mine. Like, whatever we are becoming more aware because smoke is flying over across the Canadian border into our lands, or we have as well dealt with massive fires. We are becoming aware of this heat wave. So we are beginning to, even though much of our population continues to deny the impacts of climate change, the realities are becoming more self-evident. Many of us, depending on our affluence and privilege, can shield ourselves from those impacts. So we have to pay attention to those most significantly affected, who are much more vulnerable to the implications of that. Yeah. A lot of the immigration that is taking place today is fueled by environmental degradation and changes. My work focuses on, again, this integration of faith communities, academic communities, and social change. So in the study this week, we're trying to think about how these sacred texts actually address these issues, how the ancient ones wrestle with the same questions we're wrestling with today when we think about them as big God-sized questions, right? So they were wrestling. Most of the stories in the Bible that have to do with migration are triggered by an environmental shift. Famine, the book of Ruth, which we'll touch base on later this week, begins by saying, in the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. Now, you can read right past that introduction and not pay much attention to it. But if you stop for a moment, what it means is in the time of the judges. So the book of Judges is right before. And it ends by saying, in the time of the judges, so you get the same phrase, everyone did what they thought was right in their own sight. So it's a reference to the breakdown of a political system, right? That is collapsing, right? There's a failure of political leadership. So in the time of the judges, when there's a failure of political leadership, there is a famine in the land. So what you have is this twin crisis of political collapse together with an environmental crisis. They're often connected. That leads into this story of displacement. Naomi ends up having to leave with her family. There's death, there's loss. So my interest in my own work is to say, okay, how do we listen to these stories? What happens in the story is what's called a chiastic structure, right? Everything reverses through the story. It begins in famine, it ends in harvest. It begins in death, it ends with the birth of a child that eventually becomes David. It begins with a very xenophobic, anti-immigrant sentiment and hatred across two groups. They go to Moab, the hatred place. And it ends in this integration, and it challenges even gender, right? In terms of the assumption that salvation and all of our well-being will come through the male line. And you end up with these two women that make a commitment to each other, an unsanctioned relationship between two women. Imagine that. That leads to a change where she is told at the end that Ruth is more valuable to Naomi than 7 sons. So these stories are phenomenal, right? And so my work, my invitation, my hope in the world, can we read the Bible?
That's fantastic. One final question. With all the work that you do, some of it can be very serious. There's a concept in Holden Village called Holden Hilarity. So I'm curious, how do you create levity and hilarity in your work so that you don't get too dour, which happens to a lot of people.
In fact, I think, this is one of Holden's values that I think has to be really embraced at a time of planetary crisis, of a lot of the issues that we deal with. In my work, particularly now, and in leadership formation, as a seminary and a leadership program, our focus is on the development of leaders, and the burnout rate of clergy, of other not-for-profit leadership is really significant right now.
It is,
yeah. For all kinds of reasons, the growing gap of, just what people are trying to navigate, that tragic gap that's widening about the world as it should be and the world as it is taking a toll on many of us. And so we do need a deeper well. We need hilarity, we need joy, we need possibility. Growing up in Guatemala in the middle of a civil war, that's how people deal with everything.
Right.
It's jokes. Like, I mean, I spent every recess walking around with friends telling jokes. I was amazed as a child about the sheer number of jokes that would be created. Like, every day you heard and told jokes.
Yeah.
What I really, my actual training is as a preacher, right? It's homiletics. And so stories and telling. And so I'm fascinated by jokes and stories, reading books.
Yeah, me
what
too.
I'm grateful about, and where I think, how do we not burn out, is to just tell stories, listen to stories. In the Bible study, in the session we're doing this week, we started out with this phrase from Elie Wiesel that he quotes the rabbi saying, God created humankind for the love of story. So the reason God created us is because God loves to tell and hear stories. Well, as humans right now, we are telling the most stories.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for blessing the village with your presence. Thanks for taking the time to have this conversation.
Great. Appreciate the opportunity.